Rain fell in relentless sheets over the winding lanes of the Staffordshire countryside, smearing the thatched cottages with a melancholy glaze. Mud clung to the wheels of the Duke's carriage as it trundled along, each splash a harsh reminder of the distance between the world he knew and the one he was about to enter. Within the polished carriage, the young Duke of Ravenswood, tall and imposing in his military blue coat and gold-embroidered waistcoat, sat with hands clasped, knuckles white beneath the supple leather gloves. He was a man of precise habits and commanding presence, yet this journey unsettled him more profoundly than any political negotiation or estate matter he had ever faced. Today he was to collect what was owed, a debt by law and by obligation, but beneath the veneer of duty stirred a pulse of unease, a faint echo of memory that he could not suppress. Outside, the village lay shrouded in fog, the mist curling over the low stone fences, as if whispering secrets the wind would only carry to the most observant ear. A solitary figure hurried along the lane, a basket of provisions tucked beneath her arm, cloak damp and heavy with rain. It was the woman he remembered, a former maid of his household, whose quiet diligence and soft-spoken intelligence had once captured his admiration, though he had never dared to give it voice. Time had been unkind, and the grace she once wore like a garment now struggled against the weight of circumstance. The edges of her gown, once neatly pressed and bright, now frayed and muddied. Her small, tired hands bore the calluses of ceaseless labor. At her side, children clung to her skirts, their faces pale and streaked with the evidence of hardship, their tiny feet coated in mud. Even from the carriage window the Duke could see it, the gravity of her burden, the resilience she maintained despite the world pressing against her. The carriage slowed as it approached the familiar cottage, a humble structure that had once seemed unremarkable but now stood as a monument to her endurance. Windows rattled in the storm, the hearth smoke curling weakly into the gloom, a feeble defiance against the damp chill. The Duke felt a constriction in his chest, a mingling of guilt and regret that had little place among the rigid codes of aristocracy. He had left this village years ago, leaving behind a young woman who had trusted him in the small, quiet ways of service. A smile shared across polished floors, a careful exchange of folded linens, the occasional whispered word as he passed in the hall. And now, here she was, visible evidence of the lives he had abandoned, not in malice but in obedience to duty, to expectation, to the weight of a title that demanded he look ever forward and never linger. He dismounted with deliberate grace, the boots clicking against the stone path as he approached. The maid looked up at the sound, eyes widening in a fleeting flash of recognition, and then, as though the moment were forbidden, quickly returned to the care of her children. One small boy, not more than 6, tripped over the edge of the path, falling into a puddle with a soft cry. The mother stooped immediately, brushing him off, smoothing damp hair from his forehead, her cheeks flushed with cold and effort. The Duke's breath caught in his throat. He had intended to speak with authority, to demand what was owed, to fulfill a simple obligation. Yet now, witnessing her human struggle, the words felt brittle on his tongue, a currency far too small for the depth of emotion that pressed upon him. The maid rose slowly, bearing herself with a dignity that defied the circumstance. "Your Grace," she said, voice soft yet steady, betraying neither fear nor excessive familiarity. There was a pause, a heartbeat stretched by years and unspoken histories, before he found the composure to respond. I came to settle what is due," he began, though the phrasing felt hollow in the face of her presence. She nodded, eyes flicking to the basket of goods she carried. The children clustered around her legs like sentinels of fragile hope. "The accounts, sir, they are modest," she replied, each word carefully measured. The Duke's eyes softened involuntarily, modest indeed, yet sufficient to sustain dignity for those small lives now dependent entirely upon her tireless labor. The village around them seemed to hold its breath, the rain hammering a rhythm that mirrored the beat of his heart. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, children craning their necks from doorways, witnessing a tableau of quiet tension and muted revelation. Here was the aristocrat, polished and imposing, confronted with a reality that could not be dismissed by ledger or etiquette. Here was a woman, unyielding and resolute, whose perseverance shone brighter than any gilded ballroom chandelier. The juxtaposition stung sharply. What had he thought when he departed for London? That she would manage without the world noticing? That her labor and love could simply vanish into obscurity? And yet, in this moment, shame and longing intertwined, and he realized the debt he came to collect was trivial compared to the debt he owed to conscience, to memory, to unacknowledged affection. A sharp gust of wind rattled the cottage door, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and hearth smoke. The maid adjusted her cloak, tucking a strand of damp hair behind her ear, and the Duke observed the delicate precision of the gesture, so small, yet so full of the grace he had once admired. He forced his attention to the purpose of his visit, extending a gloved hand toward the modest ledger she held. "We should account for this properly," he said, his voice tempered with a formal restraint that belied the turmoil beneath. She handed him the book with a nod, fingers brushing against his in a moment of fleeting contact, and he felt the weight of every unspoken word between them: admiration, regret, longing, and the subtle spark of something forbidden. The children, sensing the tension, huddled closer to their mother, their eyes wide and watchful. One small girl clutched a ragged doll, its dress torn yet cared for with evident love. The sight pierced him, a reminder that his own world of estates and titles had shielded him from such raw vulnerability. He read the figures, noting the modest sums, yet each numeral seemed heavier than gold when weighed against the human cost behind them. In his chest, a quiet reckoning began to unfold. Wealth and status, once measures of power, now seemed inadequate instruments of justice or care. "Your Grace," the maid said again, breaking a silence that had stretched long enough to allow the rain to speak its rhythm alone, "I trust this will suffice?" Her gaze met his fully, no pretense, no appeal, only the steadfast dignity that had survived years of toil and neglect. He swallowed hard, realizing that the debt he had come to collect was no longer about currency. It was about honor, about recognition, about a past that demanded acknowledgement before it could be truly left behind. He nodded once, curtly, yet the motion carried a weight beyond mere courtesy. As he prepared to depart, the children peered up at him with wide, expectant eyes, and the maid offered a faint smile, weary yet enduring. The Duke mounted his carriage, hands gripping the reins as he fought to master the swirl of emotions within. Rain streaked his coat, mud splashed his boots, yet he scarcely noticed. His mind was captive to the tableau he had witnessed: a life of perseverance, a love unspoken, and the fragile dignity that shone brightest under hardship. He had come to collect a debt, expecting simplicity. He left with a heart unsettled, a conscience awakened, and a memory that refused to fade. The carriage pulled away, wheels clattering over the sodden path, yet the image of the maid and her children lingered, as vivid as firelight in a dark hall. He knew the next steps would not be dictated by ledgers or social expectation alone. There was something far more compelling at work, something that demanded courage, reflection, and perhaps, in time, a reconciliation that neither fortune nor title could dictate. The village receded into mist, but the emotional imprint of the encounter remained, a gentle, insistent whisper that promised the story was far from over, and that the heart of a duke might yet be swayed by compassion, memory, and the faint, unquenchable spark of love. The following morning, a pale sun struggled to pierce the lingering veil of mist that clung to the village like a hesitant secret. The Duke of Ravenswood, still haunted by the images of the previous day, found himself compelled to return, not for obligation alone, but for a curiosity that gnawed at the edges of his composure. He had thought to deliver coins, a modest sum intended to settle the accounts, yet the moment he approached the cottage, he felt the weight of every gaze, every whispered syllable that the villagers had no doubt exchanged since his last visit. The maid stood at the threshold, children clustering at her skirts, and as she raised her eyes to meet his, the faintest flicker of acknowledgement passed between them, an unspoken recognition that bridged years of silence and social constraint. He dismounted with measured care, boots sinking slightly into the still damp earth, and produced from his coat a small parcel wrapped in simple linen. It was nothing extravagant, some flour, a few fresh eggs and a loaf of bread, but in his hands it carried the weight of intent, a subtle defiance of the expectation that he would remain aloof, indifferent, untouchable in his status. "For your household," he said, offering the parcel with a formal bow that masked the tremor in his voice. The maid hesitated, pride warring with necessity. To accept such a gift from a duke, a man of her former employer and still of society's pinnacle, would risk gossip, scandal even. Yet to refuse would imperil her children, who tugged at her skirts and murmured in quiet hunger. Her fingers closed lightly over the package, and a brief, almost imperceptible nod confirmed both acceptance and unspoken understanding. Around them, the village watched with that peculiar attention reserved for deviations from routine. A neighbor leaning from her window whispered hurriedly to another, and children pressed their noses against frost-flecked glass, eyes wide, mouths forming silent questions that carried the promise of rumor. In these small, delicate movements, the Duke felt the invisible weight of society's scrutiny pressing upon the encounter, as if the mist itself had taken the form of judgmental onlookers. Yet he did not falter. Every gesture, every measured word, was deliberate. He was aware that to act with hesitation might betray him entirely, while to act with pride alone might crush the fragile dignity of the woman before him. The maid turned her attention to her children, instructing them in the quietest tones to assist with morning chores. One small boy fetched water from the well, his hands trembling with the effort, while a girl carefully laid straw in the hearth, seeking to coax warmth from the reluctant fire. The Duke observed these motions with a mixture of awe and sorrow. He had known service, but he had never witnessed labor undertaken with such steadfast devotion and grace. Each child's careful attention to duty mirrored the mother's own quiet heroism, and the image seared itself into his memory. He realized then that the true debt he had come to reckon with was not monetary but moral, a reckoning of conscience, of respect, of acknowledgement long deferred. In the course of the morning, small moments emerged that deepened the tension between propriety and personal feeling. A basket tipped slightly, threatening to spill its contents onto the muddy floor, and the Duke's hand shot forward instinctively, steadying it before it fell. Their fingers brushed in the action and the contact lingered, a spark too subtle for the villagers to perceive, yet electric in its private significance. The maid's cheeks flushed, her eyes briefly lowering, and in that modest display of emotion, the Duke saw the ghost of the woman he had admired years ago. Here was a bravery tempered with humility, a beauty refined by endurance, and an intimacy forged through unspoken recognition of shared history. As the morning progressed, the Duke found reason to remain, offering minor assistance in tasks that would ordinarily have seemed beneath a man of his station. He carried water to the garden, adjusted a rickety shutter against the wind, and observed the children as they attempted to sweep the mud from the cottage path. Each act, seemingly mundane, carried significance. It was a statement of equality in service, a defiance of the rigid hierarchies that dictated that he should remain distant, untouchable. The maid watched silently, accepting his help with cautious gratitude, aware of the scandal that could follow if a neighbor were to witness the intimacy of such cooperation. Yet her heart, tempered by years of solitude and resilience, allowed a private appreciation to bloom, acknowledging the subtle courage required for both of them to act against convention. At midday, a minor disruption heralded the first whisper of scandal. A carriage from the neighboring estate, driven by an officious steward, passed the cottage and glimpsed the Duke engaged in seemingly menial work alongside a maid. A raised eyebrow, a subtle gesture of surprise, and the steward's gaze lingered long enough to commit the sight to memory. The potential for gossip, though yet unrealized, hovered like a delicate blade over the morning's tranquility. The Duke, aware of the implication, did not withdraw. Instead, he allowed the scene to continue, confident that dignity and honesty would outweigh rumor, and that the silent acknowledgement of her struggle held a gravity no scandal could diminish. As afternoon waned, the Duke and the maid found themselves alone for a brief moment, tending to the garden while the children played nearby. The exchange of words was sparse but weighted. "You have managed well," he said, voice low, careful, acknowledging not just her practical success but her perseverance through hardship. She looked up, a shadow of pride and humility flickering in her eyes. "I do what I must," she replied, measured and composed, yet every syllable carried the subtle vibration of restrained emotion. The dialogue, though ordinary in content, resonated profoundly in the spaces between words, an acknowledgement of shared understanding, of long-suppressed regard, of emotional terrain too dangerous for open exploration. A sudden breeze disturbed the carefully arranged flowers in the small garden, scattering petals and soil alike. The Duke stooped instinctively to gather them, and the maid joined him, hands meeting briefly over a stubborn rose that refused to stay upright. Neither spoke, yet in the silence lay a communication more profound than words, a mutual recognition of endurance, of affection, and of societal boundaries defied, however fleetingly. The children's laughter echoed faintly, a reminder of the stakes at play, the continuation of innocence, the preservation of dignity, and the fragile possibility of hope within hardship. By late afternoon, the parcel had been unpacked and small items distributed, eggs set aside for the children's nourishment, flour measured for bread, and the loaf placed upon the modest table with care. The Duke lingered, sensing that any departure now might diminish the significance of the morning, that a hasty retreat could unravel the delicate tapestry of trust, recognition, and subtle intimacy they had woven. Villagers had begun to notice the prolonged interaction, eyes peering cautiously from windows and doorways. Yet the Duke and the maid remained undisturbed, absorbed in the private cadence of action and glance, aware that the scrutiny of society was ever present, but committed to a course dictated by conscience and sentiment rather than expectation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Casting long shadows across the cottage and the damp garden, the Duke prepared to take his leave. The maid, brushing soil from her hands, met his gaze squarely for the first time that day, and the recognition in her eyes was unmistakable. Gratitude, acknowledgement, and a subtle invitation to reconsider the boundaries imposed by circumstance. "Your Grace," she said softly, a note of quiet entreaty in her voice, "you honor us more than you know." He inclined his head, heart tightening with a mixture of humility and burgeoning affection, and for the first time, he understood that the scandal he had feared was but a shadow against the brighter light of human connection, and that the tokens of his visit, modest, respectful, meaningful, were enough to bridge the chasm that years of duty and expectation had imposed. As the carriage wheels began to turn, mud splashing against the lane once more, the Duke's eyes lingered on the cottage, on the maid, on the small children, and on the fragile dignity they embodied. He had come to settle a debt, yet he departed with something far weightier, a sense of moral reckoning, a recognition of enduring affection, and a realization that the course of his heart might yet defy the rigid strictures of society. And as the mist thickened once more over the village, it seemed to carry not only the chill of winter, but the whisper of possibility, an unspoken promise that the story, far from concluded, was only beginning to unfold. The evening descended upon the village like a velvet curtain, softening the edges of cottages and cloistered fields, while the last embers of sunlight struggled through the low-hanging clouds. Within the modest cottage, a fire crackled with uneven warmth, casting flickering shadows upon the walls and illuminating the worn features of the maid, whose hands trembled slightly as she folded a bundle of freshly laundered linen. Outside, the children had been coaxed into slumber by a whispered story and a gentle touch, their breaths rising in shallow, rhythmic waves. The Duke of Ravenswood remained near the hearth, seated in deliberate quiet, the weight of his presence both commanding and strangely deferential. He had returned, not merely out of obligation, but drawn by a force he had not yet named, a compulsion to witness her world, to confront the truths that neither time nor title could erase. He cleared his throat softly, conscious that every word he spoke would carry significance, not merely in content but in intention. "You have managed admirably," he said, voice low, measured, yet rich with unspoken emotion. The maid looked up, her eyes reflecting both the firelight and the shadows of memory. "I do what I must," she replied, her tone steady, yet there was a tremor beneath her words, subtle and revealing. For years she had masked vulnerability behind diligence. Now the Duke's presence rendered the mask almost unbearably fragile. She had anticipated judgment, perhaps condescension, and instead found a quiet reverence that unsettled her, that demanded she reckon not only with the obligations of daily survival but with the stirrings of emotion she had long suppressed. The room smelled of wet earth, soot, and the faint sweetness of drying linen, a combination that carried him back to afternoons spent within the manor, watching her meticulous care with the same attention he now observed in her unpretentious home. A child's toy, a rudimentary wooden horse, lay forgotten at the edge of the hearth, a testament to the presence of small lives dependent upon her vigilance. He felt a pang, a deep and unyielding ache of guilt and affection intertwined. "I had thought," he began slowly, "that when I left, the passage of time would erase the debt of attention I owe you." The words hovered, suspended by both hesitation and the intimacy they carried. It was not a financial debt he referenced, but the unspoken obligations of conscience, respect, and lingering admiration. She lowered her gaze, pressing a palm to the hearth as though it might anchor her trembling heart. "Your Grace," she whispered, and the single title, uttered so softly, resonated with a mixture of reverence, resentment, and latent longing. The Duke rose, stepping closer, mindful of propriety yet compelled by the invisible gravity of shared history. "Years have passed," he said, "yet I find that absence has done nothing to diminish what I should have acknowledged long ago." His words were formal, yet beneath them lay a vulnerability he rarely allowed the world to perceive. Her eyes met his fully, unshielded, revealing a flicker of emotion that mirrored his own, a quiet reckoning with loss, memory, and unspoken desire. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, drawing their attention outward to the darkened landscape, where shadows of trees swayed against the moonlight, indifferent to the private drama unfolding within the cottage. He extended a hand, not in command but as an offer of connection. "I have come not merely to settle what is due in the ledger," he said, voice low, resonant, "but to confess what has lain upon my conscience unspoken for far too long." She hesitated, caught between prudence and the irresistible pull of shared history, before tentatively placing her hand in his, the warmth of her skin igniting a quiet fire of awareness within him. In that simple touch lay a universe of acknowledgement, regret, admiration, longing, and a fragile hope that the boundaries imposed by society might yet be transcended. Her voice, when it came, was steady but tinged with emotion. "I have endured, Your Grace, as any woman must when circumstance demands vigilance and sacrifice," she said, glancing toward the hearth where her children slept. "Yet I have not forgotten," she paused, swallowing the tremor of sentiment, "I have not forgotten kindness, nor the rare moments when my efforts were seen and valued." The Duke's chest tightened, the quiet rhythm of his pulse echoing the gravity of her confession. It was a revelation not merely of gratitude, but of enduring emotional attachment, a tether connecting past and present across the chasm of social expectation. For a long moment, they remained in silent communion, the fire casting gentle illumination on their features, the air charged with a quiet electricity of mutual understanding. Then, with deliberate care, he lowered himself to a chair beside hers, removing gloves with precise attention, as though the act itself symbolized a shedding of formal barriers. "I have been blind," he admitted, voice thick with suppressed emotion, "to the courage, the grace, and the fortitude you have displayed. I believed duty alone demanded my attention elsewhere, yet I now see the greater duty was to acknowledge you, to honor what was true and enduring." His words were a confession, a laying bare of both heart and conscience, and they resonated with an intimacy that eclipsed all propriety. She regarded him silently, her gaze softened by the flickering firelight, considering the magnitude of his revelation. "And now?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper, laden with inquiry and tentative hope. "Now," he replied, eyes steady yet vulnerable, "I seek not to alter the past but to embrace what remains, an opportunity to act with honor, to offer protection, and if it pleases you to acknowledge what I have long suppressed, my esteem, my regard, and perhaps my heart." The phrasing, carefully formal yet suffused with latent ardor, left the room vibrating with unspoken possibilities, a quiet crescendo that carried both risk and promise. Outside, the storm had spent itself, leaving the village washed and glistening under a pale, emerging moon. The silence within the cottage was punctuated only by the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle, steady breathing of sleeping children. In that quiet, the maid extended her hand, fingertips brushing his in a gesture both deliberate and hesitant. "If your heart is true," she murmured, "then we may find a path, one that honors both duty and feeling." The Duke nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to the back of her hand, a gesture that spoke of reverence, commitment, and unspoken longing. In that moment, the emotional turning point was complete. Walls erected by pride and society began to crumble under the gentle, insistent force of mutual recognition. He rose slowly, offering her a hand to stand, and together they moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, each contemplating the distance yet to traverse. There was much to consider: the children, the village, the rigid expectations of the aristocracy, and the delicate balance of pride and humility that governed their interactions. Yet for the first time the Duke felt a clarity of purpose that transcended ledger and title, a recognition that the true measure of nobility lay in courage, compassion, and the willingness to act upon the truths of the heart. As the night deepened, the hearth flickered low, casting elongated shadows that seemed to embrace the cottage with warmth and secrecy. In that intimate space, both recognized the fragile beginnings of something enduring, a bond forged not only by shared history but by confession, understanding, and the tentative acknowledgement of love that had survived the trials of years and circumstance. The private revelation, tender and weighty, promised a course that would defy convention yet honor dignity, a path that neither could walk lightly, yet neither could deny. The maid finally spoke again, her voice steady now, tempered by resolve. "Let us proceed carefully, with both caution and courage," she said. "For the world beyond this cottage is unforgiving, yet within these walls, we may carve a sanctuary even if brief." The Duke's hand found hers once more, firm, unwavering, a silent affirmation of the promise contained in her words. Outside, the village remained asleep under the silvered moon, unaware of the private transformation unfolding within a modest hearthlit room. And as the fire sputtered and the embers glowed faintly, both understood that the story, long suspended between duty and desire, had reached a turning point, one that would guide the course of the heart with unerring force, yet demand patience, prudence, and an enduring courage neither had fully anticipated. Dawn broke over the Staffordshire countryside in muted gold and silvery mist, as if the world itself hesitated in reverence for the day's unfolding. The Duke of Ravenswood, having spent the night in reflection by the dim hearth, felt a resolve tempered by the delicate knowledge of the heart's fragility. The previous evening's confession, tender and vulnerable, had carved a path through years of social expectation and pride, yet now the weight of action pressed upon him. To hesitate further would risk both their dignity and the subtle trust they had begun to cultivate. He dressed with meticulous care, donning his dark coat and waistcoat, the fabric crisp, yet softened by familiarity, and adjusted the gloves that had become an extension of his authority. Today he would offer more than words. Today he would offer both protection and declaration, a tangible acknowledgement of what society deemed improbable. The cottage stirred with life as the maid prepared the children for the day, her movements efficient yet graceful, a reflection of her enduring fortitude. She glanced at him from across the room, a quiet question in her eyes, and he returned a nod imbued with certainty, a silent promise that their conversation would honor both propriety and sentiment. The children, sensing the charged atmosphere between the adults, clung briefly to their mother before resuming their play with whispered laughter and shy curiosity. Outside, the sun's light filtered through lingering fog, casting the garden in a soft luminescence that mirrored the tentative hope blooming within the cottage walls. Stepping forward, the Duke presented a small envelope, tied with a simple ribbon, a token of both commitment and reassurance. "Within these papers," he began, his voice low yet unwavering, "are arrangements to secure your household, to ensure the well-being of your children without reliance upon me as debtor or master, but as one who holds you in esteem." The maid's hands hovered, hesitating between propriety and necessity, before she accepted the envelope with care. The gesture was simple, yet its gravity resonated deeply. He was not merely offering aid, but asserting a deliberate choice to honor her independence while entwining their fates with dignity intact. In that moment, the social scaffolding that constrained both their lives seemed to bend, allowing the possibility of mutual regard and even affection without shame or compromise. The Duke stepped closer, the firelight from the hearth catching the gold thread of his waistcoat, illuminating a face both proud and vulnerably open. "I must speak plainly," he continued, his gaze fixed on hers with intensity and sincerity. "I have long withheld acknowledgement of my regard, restrained by duty and expectation, yet I cannot allow prudence alone to govern what is just and true. You have endured hardship with courage I have failed to honor, and in that endurance, I have seen the measure of nobility greater than any title or estate." The maid's eyes, reflecting both surprise and quiet understanding, softened. She recognized the truth in his words, the deliberate courage required to transcend social strictures, and the quiet acknowledgement of her own strength that validated years of unseen toil. For a moment, silence enveloped them, broken only by the muted crackle of embers and the faint rustling of the children as they played nearby. Then, with deliberate care, the Duke removed his gloves, an unspoken symbol of vulnerability and readiness. "I offer not merely my protection," he said, voice low, earnest and resonant, "but the sincere wish to walk beside you should you permit it, not as master to servant, nor as noble to dependent, but as one who recognizes and esteems the true character of your heart. I ask for your consent, in freedom and trust, to allow a bond that transcends station, yet honors the dignity of both our lives." His words, formal yet charged with intimate longing, filled the room with the weight of their shared history and the promise of possibility. The maid, who had borne adversity with quiet resilience, allowed herself a small breath, steadying the tremor that had long lingered in her chest. "Your Grace," she began, carefully measured, "you speak with candor and courage, qualities I have learned to value above all else. I have long feared that propriety and circumstance would forever silence acknowledgement of what is just, true, and necessary." Her voice strengthened as she continued, "If we are to proceed, let it be with transparency, mutual respect, and a commitment to the children, whose welfare must guide our actions above sentiment alone." The Duke inclined his head, understanding that her response was not merely acceptance but an assertion of equality and reasoned choice, a union born not of impulse but of deliberate, considered emotion. As the morning light strengthened, illuminating the small garden and the modest paths of the village beyond, the Duke took her hand gently in both of his, allowing the warmth of connection to communicate what words could only partially express. "Then let us proceed," he said softly yet with conviction, with courage and compassion, bound by honor, guided by conscience, and tempered by the knowledge that the truest expression of love is not in grandeur or display, but in steadfast support, protection, and the acknowledgement of what has endured. In that gesture, all barriers imposed by title, expectation, and societal hierarchy seemed to dissolve, leaving only two hearts aligned in purpose and feeling. The children, sensing the rare solemnity of the moment, gathered briefly around the pair, their small hands brushing the Duke's coat and the maid's skirts. In their innocent curiosity, he saw the tangible consequence of choices and commitments, the delicate intertwining of past neglect, present recognition and future care. He knelt slightly, addressing them with gentle warmth, promising attentiveness, guidance and protection, ensuring that the bond forged with their mother extended naturally to the guardianship of their well-being. The maid watched, pride mingled with relief, acknowledging that the Duke's words were no mere formalities but carried the weight of intention and responsibility. By mid-morning, the village had begun its daily rhythms, unaware of the profound realignment occurring within the modest cottage. The Duke and the maid moved with deliberate care, arranging papers, discussing provisions, and charting a course that balanced dignity, security, and the private acknowledgement of mutual affection. Every glance, every careful touch, resonated with a depth of meaning that was at once exhilarating and sobering. Society, with its rigid expectations and propensity for rumor, existed only as a distant, murmuring background, powerless to alter the course of hearts now committed to deliberate, honorable union. As noon approached, the Duke paused by the window, gazing outward at the rolling countryside, the trees swaying gently in a forgiving breeze. "The world beyond these walls may not understand," he said, voice contemplative, "yet within them we may craft a space where duty, affection and respect coexist, where our choices honor both conscience and the enduring nature of what is just." The maid nodded, her expression serene yet resolute, and in that quiet affirmation, he felt the culmination of weeks of suppressed emotion, reflection, and moral reckoning. It was not the flash of passion, but the deliberate alignment of hearts, minds, and intentions that marked the true climax of their story. Finally, with hands intertwined and hearts aligned, the Duke and the maid stepped briefly into the garden, allowing the sunlight to fall upon them and the children. The air, scented with damp earth and the faint fragrance of early blooms, seemed to bless the quiet covenant forged through confession, acknowledgement and steadfast intent. No proclamation to society would be required. The declaration was made in action, in care, in the deliberate choice to honor dignity, affection and shared history. The Duke, once consumed by pride and duty, now understood the fullness of nobility. It lay not in estates, titles or appearances, but in courage, compassion, and the quiet devotion to what was morally and emotionally just. As the day progressed, they moved together with purposeful ease, a subtle choreography of gestures and attentiveness that reaffirmed trust, commitment, and shared responsibility. The children, reassured by the constancy of both adults, thrived under the warmth of inclusion and care, their laughter blending with the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of village life. In that harmony, the Duke and the maid recognized that the narrative of their lives had shifted irrevocably, from obligation to choice, from isolation to connection, from silence to acknowledgement. The story of the heart, tempered by endurance, propriety and courage, had reached its fulfillment, and yet promised continued richness in the unfolding days to come. As twilight approached, the cottage glowed faintly from within, a beacon of warmth, dignity and enduring hope. The Duke, standing by the doorway, allowed his gaze to linger on the family he had come to protect and cherish, his heart full with a quiet, unwavering understanding of what true love and honor required. The maid, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, mirrored his reflection, the two aligned not merely in circumstance, but in the deliberate, careful cultivation of a bond that defied expectation yet honored all that was enduring and just. And so, as the sun dipped behind distant hills, the chapter closed with hearts aligned, dignity preserved, and the promise of enduring affection guiding the course of their shared future.